Oh, Michael is here. Yeah, Michael, go ahead. I don't know, want to introduce yourself.
Hey everyone, yeah, I'm Michael. I'm from Veeam Software. Get that out of the way. I'm not going to talk too much about like point solutions or anything like that, but just the importance of when we see stateful workloads land in Kubernetes or even outside of that, and the application is leveraging like AWS RDS or something like that, we have to consider the protection, the mobility, and all of that good, the security of that stateful workload. Even more so as we start to see virtual machines land in Kubernetes. That's your literally the stereotypical stateful workload. So we have to think about how we protect that in a application consistent way.
Interesting. When you say VMs landing in Kubernetes, you're talking about like KubeVirt?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
Cuba.
okay. Yeah, it's becoming popular by the fact of VMware lately.
100%.
Yeah.
Hypervisor Hunger Games.
Yes. Okay, so let's get started on backing up. It says workload. So I think it also mentions etcd, right? So usually etcd is like the backup. It's the Kubernetes database, and then the things that run in pods, and pods use uh, persistent volumes, and then it's backing up the workload. But the workload definition, I would say, right? etcd is the backup resolution. So anyone, Scott or Michael, wants to kick off the introduction of this and talking about etcd? I think that's the first topic about like
Yep, that
performing
is
a
the first
backup on
topic.
etcd, and why
Yeah.
would need to do that. And I can add like the part of like like the point of view of like a cloud provider, like a managed Kubernetes, where users don't have direct access to etcd.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people, and I think Michael, that's when you said, it's important to back up. If people always think, well, it's Kubernetes, we're all stateless, we do this, we can just, who cares? I'm a big multi-tenant fan. That's not a secret, right? So is Mark. So I think even more so about those backup, because you probably got a ton of CRDs, right? You've got some different RBAC, custom RBAC. You might have, 6, 7, 800 namespaces. So yeah, granted, if you got a great GitOps platform and you lose the whole cluster, you might say, well, just have everybody, kick off their pipelines. I can tell you one thing, that's just not true in the world, right? Maybe 30, 40% had some really great automation pipelines, but not everybody has that. And understandably so. So if you got to restore, you need it, right? And I just can't call that out enough for myself. And there's other reasons too, right? We covered that in the chapter about, somebody has a problem with a workload. I might back up that namespace and go put it on a dev cluster somewhere, just so I can say, cool, I want the exact same thing that they're doing, right? I got to do apples to apples comparison. So a lot of people don't think about that on it. So I'm glad, Michael, when you said that. And by the way, big fan of Kasten. I have been since before Veeam bought them, right? I used to talk to the founder quite a bit in the early days. Great group of people. So on etcd though, Carlos, right? I think I call it out here saying, look, that is your cluster, right? I mean, that's where everything goes. You don't have etcd, what do you have? Really a lot of bricks, because you're not going to get very far. So at the very least, you may not be backing up everything, right? I mean, I still kind of like doing that, but you get your etcd backup. Now in the chapter, we cover how to back up etcd. We don't cover restoring it, and that's simply because of the limitation of kind and the whole inception idea of like inside the cluster doing this. You just can only do so much. But so we do in this section that you have. We have a couple of scripts. We got multiple ways you can do it, right? You could use a container to go back up. You could do some copies. If you have direct node access, there's a couple ways. But we do the TLS is probably the one thing a lot of people forget about. I've talked to people where they back it up, but they don't have their certificates, right? I'm like, well, that's not going to help you very much, right? Because you got to have to supply those with your etcd control command. So always good to get this. I know some people that keep like 60 copies, and I'm like, yeah, that's probably not that beneficial. You're probably not going to roll it back, 60 times. I guess maybe fringe cases, but I would think maybe a day or two Other circumstances, but usually you're going to not need those. They're not very big, in retrospect, but there's no reason to keep all of those. So yeah, I
So
mean, I would say in that.
certificates, yeah, something that I think other places where even the Kubernetes documentation, and then this is if you have taken or studying for the CK, this is something that comes in the CK of like how to use the etcd CTL to do a backup, and basically like do like the word snapshot is there, right? And that's a concept that comes up a lot in backing up. So it's like two things: is the certificates, like things that are stateful, like important things, like the minimum that you say, Scott, right? Save the certificates. You can create them again, and such. But if you have your worker nodes already running and you want to restore the control plane, you have to have, you cannot just recreate all these CA right, keys and pairs, and that's where you're stuck. And then you can find your situations, and this is when you like have Kubernetes like home or home lab, or like you like kubeadm type of things, like you restore your etcd because you follow the CK, and then things don't connect because you forgot to back up this little folder about the PKI folder, right? So I think that's a good thing that you brought in here on doing that. The other thing I would say is so etcd is living in a folder, right, in Linux. But there's the concept of like backing up that folder, right, raw files, taking it out. But there's also the concept of application, like you do it through, you tell the application go ahead and do a backup. And that's some concepts that some people don't know, like I think I saw in the Kanister or Kasten, they have blueprints that have like application. Like you have to tell MySQL, this is how I back up SQL. Like there have to be application where you can just take files that are like being modified in the fly to just back up things. I think that's just maybe if your university also want to level set for people that like visit here and these things, like they may think files are sitting in a folder, so the only thing that I need to do is just copy CP, right? But that's for us that have been for a while like, well, that's the log of the database is a file at the end of the day, but it's on transit, right? There's open files, and you have to tell the application, I want you to do the snapshot incremental or full to this place, and that place may be another folder that then that folder may be pushed to the cloud like object storage.
It's an age-old problem with backups, right, Carlos? This goes back in time with agents. People backing up Oracle, SQL, Exchange. People just would point to it and be like, "Why does it fail?" No, because you can't back that up. It's open, right? You need some kind of agent to understand it, and I think that's where the casting blueprints come in, right, to assist with that.
Yep, and Michael put it there like for etcd compliance regulations. Some regulations ask you sometimes up to 3 years that you have to back up things, right? To pass some regulations and compliance. So backing up etcd is the center of it. Let me see another thing. So before we jump into Velero is this is something to introduce into Velero. So this is when you have access to the Linux system. Just to highlight, this is when you have access to the Linux system that has the etcd, that you can talk to the etcd, right, with the etcd CTL CLI. In some other environments where you use Kubernetes, I can talk about the cloud provider that I work with. Yeah, we offer a managed Kubernetes service. It's called EKS. You don't have access to run etcd and then talk to the etcd database directly, or you don't have access to that control plane. So the only thing that, because it's a good thing, right? You don't want you want the cloud provider to access that. So if you want to get a copy of the workload definitions, right, on a namespace, like a deployment or a config map that you deployed, you have to do it through the access of kube API, right? That REST API that is there. And one of the tools I introduced here is Velero, right? And this is something that is actually used on, I've seen people using in EKS, because it's a tool that can talk to the QP API server where you have access to that cluster, and then back up the resources of a namespace, or back up the CRD sometimes, to back up those things. Michael or Scott want to introduce what Velero, like a little bit of background what Velero is?
Oh yeah, so Valero, I don't know if you can even call it VMware's Valero. That's exactly where it started though. Or at least there's a lot of history behind where it came from,
Heptio, right? And then they bought them,
yeah,
and
there you go.
then it became Tanzu for a while.
And yeah, now if you look at it, actually Red Hat are probably the biggest contributors to Valero with their ODP, their OpenShift data protection. But ultimately, as you said, Carlos, it's an open source project that enables you to protect the ultimately the applications, the YAML manifest behind that application, and allow you to protect that and push that into a location that is not in the cluster as well, which is obviously key. We can take as many snapshots as you want, but if something bad happens to that cluster, then we're not going to be able to recover that. So you want to make sure that you get a copy of that outside, whether that's object storage or somewhere else. And I think that's in general, but that's exactly what Velero does. But that being kind of the de facto, our biggest headache when we go into enterprises is people using Velero or doing nothing when it comes to protection. And I would much rather someone use Velero and save their stuff than do nothing, because it's well, salespeople would say something different, but it's much easier. It's much better to have a copy of the data somewhere than not to have it when bad things are happening.
It's like an insurance policy, right, Michael? Nobody wants one. You buy it just in case. I mean,
100%.
You hope to never use it, but if you need to, you're in trouble without it, right?
Yeah. So for Velero, let me see where it was. Yeah. So for Velero, the key aspect of Velero is, and I think it's not on the CNCF. I always have that assumption for some reason. It's not in the CNCF. I think it's still under VMware's, but a lot of companies have support, even products like Cloud Casa, Red Hat, other people use it. And it's a controller that you install on the same cluster that you want to back up, and then has different CRDs. And it has actually has a CLI to do that. But it backs up to object storage. So you can see here in the chapter of like you're backing up etcd, and etcd is not that large when it comes, like when people that know where Kubernetes is or etcd, right? We're not talking about terabytes of files, right? To define a deployment is like a few kilobytes of YAML, right? So that YAML goes into etcd or JSON, right? It gets stored in there in the etcd database, and then you get it out. But that YAML files, and we'll get into the topic of PVs and PVCs later. But in terms of the definitions, like when you do kubectl and you apply those YAMLs, they get stored in etcd, and then this tool, you can like tell it to say back up this resource, or back up the things in this namespace, resources within this namespace, or back up the global resources like cluster roles or CRDs, and they will go, and then the utility will have connections to object storage, like example S3 or Min IO. I always call it Minio for some reason, but Minio. It will put that into that location, and the transfer is over HTTP. That's why it's very flexible to put that. Any stories? I can tell one story that usually I tell people of, like I'll have two stories. So the first story is what happens if by mistake somebody deletes a CRD? What is the worst that can happen? Like if I deploy something like an Istio resource, or I deploy a Velero CR and I delete the CRD, what happens to everything keeps running, the controller is happy, or maybe you cannot create new things. But what happens? Anyone wants to guess? I
CR
guess like
gets
you cannot create more things.
CR gets deleted. All the CRs.
Anyone
Yeah,
else?
anything relying on that is gonna break. You might as well. You could almost, if you deleted the cluster, you'd probably make a mess, less of a
Yeah.
mess, because at least you've got. If you deleted the cluster, at least you know the cluster's gone. You start deleting CRDs, then you're you've got a mashup of not working stuff.
But I believe as long as no health check is running or calling the dynamic admission controllers, things will still run.
But if the pod restarts, it's going to give you an error, definitely. You should be able to track that down. But like you said, Michael, that's only one. Right? I mean, most things have how many CRDs of them?
For the most part, like the typical community software Helm charts that you deploy in your cluster, you delete the CRD, all the CRs are gone, and that's a very surprise. Guess when people find out they didn't know that when they they delete the CRD. Why? And it's not doing it intentionally. It's because sometimes they're trying to upgrade the software, Istio or like whatever, an add-on, and the controller gets stuck, or the Helm chart gets stuck, or Argo Flux gets stuck. Like, you know what? I'm going to just delete the Helm chart, right? And that deletes the CRD, and then apply it again. When I apply it again, like, where's all my stuff that was there? Gone. So that's usually when they find out and look good in Google, right? And then ask like, yeah, your CRD is gone, you're out. And then to recover, like Michael was saying, or Scott was saying, you can do that with GitOps and they get everything up and running. But some clusters are complex enough that they have been running for a while, that at some point things happen imperative and in order to get that cluster running in production, and they might not have the maturity, like Michael said, to have like a bull green or doing DRs, or like, let's to create a new cluster from scratch. It takes 2 hours, but sometimes you need an RTO that is like minutes, right? So the best thing you can do is backup SCD, like have this, it's a small amount of data, it's not terabytes, not cost you a lot. Just have a schedule that backups these namespaces, the CRDs somewhere, and then if something catastrophic happens, bring up a new cluster, point Velero to that S3 bucket that is costing you maybe dollars a month, right? Almost nothing, because it's just kilobytes or maybe megabytes. I think the most could be, if you have a full SCD, it will be 8 gigs or 10 gigs in a managed provider. And then we'll back it up, and then you're up and running in minutes. And then you deploy, you sync up back your GitOps thing, and then everything gets synced. That. So that's one of the stories that I have around etcd, backing up etcd YAML files. The second one is people may say, I have something simple that I can just deploy the everything from GitOps. That works for the most part. In one use case that doesn't work is if you're using a tool called Crossplane. So a Crossplane composition, when you create something, Crossplane creates infrastructure as code, like S3 buckets, RDS database, all these things. Behind the scenes, Crossplane creates dynamically these CRs, but they have the unique ID of the cloud provider name. So that becomes something that only exists on that cluster. So if you lose the cluster or you lose that SCD, to recover back that cross-plane operations, it's impossible to do it from a claim, because all those IDs get generated. So as a best practice, if you're a cross-plane user, or I guess ACK and other ones, you have to SCD to bring you back up to speed. I gave a talk in one of the DevOps days around that. Just to highlight that, people may tell you that, or may you find information online that says, oh, everything can be recovered from Git, right? And that's not usually the case. Or maybe you have an environment where you need a low RTO. Anyone else has other stories to add?
We've had a hand up for a little while.
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
I have a question not Carlos. Can Velero do the same like a backup HCD? It does that like natively, like or they are two different?
It was two different processes. I mean, if you were to have a control, it depends where your etcd resides too, right? In that case, so let's say you had an admin cluster that had your control plane and you had a user cluster, or something like cloud providers almost do, right? That's how like GKE will run or Anthos. Most people don't put stuff in their admin cluster, so you wouldn't get the etcd, but you could. But myself, I don't do it that way. And I know, Michael, you'd have to keep me up to date on this, but I know Caston at one time didn't do a thing with etcd, right? It was not meant for that. I don't know if it was ever added, but going back about 4 years ago. So it's been a while.
Yeah, the question is the answer is like yes and no. Like
Yeah.
Velero talks to the kubectl, kube API server. So it's talking through the kube API server to get all the information from etcd. And then essentially you are backing up etcd through the kube API server, and then that becomes TGZs in Velero. So you're kind of like backing up etcd at the end of the day. It's just different protocols instead directly to the etcd CTL versus kube API server.
And
Jack, you have a question?
Also okay.
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Saif, if you have a follow-up.
It's a continuity for the same question. It does also the same for the certificate, right? Which are needed.
Oh, certificates of you have to go to the Linux system.
All right.
Jack, go ahead.
Okay, so I don't know if you're covering this because I understand you're talking about etcd backup, but what if I have Postgres, a Postgres controller? Does Velero play with that? I'm sorry. I will click on the website and I will do homework next time. I just don't understand. I'm really nervous about putting databases on Kubernetes because I change the releases on Kubernetes more frequently than I update databases.
It's interesting you say that, Jack. That's a big. I did a talk at KubeCon in Detroit actually with DreamWorks, and all their databases are on Kubernetes. So of course you're talking about a huge, movie company and all that, right? Granted, we didn't get into backups, but in that case, that's where we're getting into. I know something like Caston would have. I'm going to say the blueprints for that, right, Michael? I mean, I'm assuming there's one for Postgres. At Valero natively, I don't think you could use, the Rustic or the Cookia plugin for that because it won't, because the database is open, right? There's no agent built into Valero. There might be a community for it, but you're definitely getting into a part where I'm going to tell you it's capable if it has the intelligence to know how to do that with a database.
So I think, exactly that, Scott. So Velero gets you down to the PVC layer. So whatever's in that PVC, Velero can, it's just going to, Velero comes along and it goes, right, I'm going to have that. I'm going to send it to your S bucket. And Jack, if you work with databases, you know how they don't like. They don't like
it at all. Right? I hear you. So for me, the best practice is use database dumps. Use backup follow database dump.
We have two approaches to this, as Scott said. So from a Caston point of view, we have an open source project called Kanister. Kanister goes into the PVC, talks to the Postgres database or whatever that data service is, can do either a snapshot consistent copy of that, or it can talk to the native data service such as PG dump and say, please, we want to take a nice backup of this, and we're going to send that to and we're going to send that off to object storage. So that's a bit of a nicer way of talking to a stateful set of data services. Equally, though, when you've got things like CMPG or crunchy data or operator models, clearly the operator has more control over that. So again, with Caston Kanister, we talk to the operator and say, look, we'd like to take a backup of this cluster. What's the best way to do that? And that's how we navigate that. And
okay, I'll do some homework on that. Thank you.
So, but just to go full circle where Velero is and where Kanister is, there was actually talk a couple of years ago about, I can use Velero to get my application, my YAML manifest that make up that application, the PVCs, the PVs. Kanister doesn't do that. But we could ultimately use Velero to trigger Kanister. If you wanted to go all open source and everything's good that way, you could do that. The two projects would give you that outcome that you're looking for, Jack.
Okay.
That's really what Kasten does on top of all of this. Is it's an orchestration to all of these different data services that you might have running.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
One thing to think of, Jack, and I'm a Valero fan, but I also come from the VMware world for many years. But if you get in the database or PVCs, a lot of PVCs, it does have some concurrency problems. Might be the friendliest way of saying it. By default, it deals with one event at a time. So you get a PVC, a lot of PVCs, and you start to restore it. You're waiting in line. Now you can change that, but even the documentation doesn't really say what to do or how. Like it says, whatever resources you have, you can make it. Okay, that's great. What exactly is that? So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but if you had a big cluster and suddenly you had to do a restore of, I don't know, 300 PVCs with databases, I don't even know how long that would take. Hopefully you wouldn't get to that point, right? Because that can have an event, a resume building event, rather than even restoring event because something bad happened.
Yeah, and this is so the PVCs. So Velero supports PVCs, and we will move the files to S3. So if you have like flat files or whatever files you have in that PVC, like Michael said, it will Velero will copy that to S3 object. Maybe a question for Michael. Michael, what happens? You said, what happens if I just stop the database, PostgreSQL? I just stop it, like or delete it in that cluster. Can Velero just copy the files to S3 and then go to another cluster and restore the PVC? Is that possible, or do you have to go to the route of the PG dump?
So the way I position that or talk about that is that it's a bit like on your PC, pulling out that power cable and then moving your PC to another room, plugging it in. Will it come back up? Probably. I don't really want to have probably when it's a Postgres database with my mission critical data on. So will it come back up? Whereas I would much rather go to my PC, hit shutdown, then power it down, and then take it to the next place. So that's the difference. So will Velero grab it and all of the contents of that PVC? Yeah, absolutely. If we think about a database, it's going to be a flat file in that file system. It just doesn't know if there's 1,000 transactions hitting that. It's gonna stop it at one point, and you're gonna potentially lose however many of them, which is probably not good if that's your money-making database. So that's how Is it good for unstructured data on a PVC? 100%. Like we're just copying and pasting data from A to B.
Great. So the reason I ask is the same thing for Veeam Kasten, like right? It's the same concept. If I have a PVC and I want to back it up with Kasten, which is an open source solution from Veeam, it's essentially the same thing, right? A Postgres database, you're using Kasten, you move it up, but this would not be the recommendation. The recommendation would be like, you need to use something like it. You need to orchestrate based on the application, and this is where Kanister comes in, right?
Yeah. So Kasten uses Kanister to orchestrate that whole process.
So this is what I have here. I was looking this morning at Kanister.
A blueprint. So this is a blueprint. It's basically a bash script wrapped around a couple of CRs, and you're basically saying, right, what do you want to do when we say back up? What do you want us to do? How do you want us to talk to that particular data service? This is Postgres, a stateful set Postgres. There's obviously a load of different examples that Carlos, you can see down the side, and we're going to use something called kubetask, which is ultimately we're going to spin up a container. We're going to use this to then connect into our Postgres pod, and then we're going to use the secret from Kubernetes to get in. And then we're going to run through this bash script. If you go down a couple of lines, and you can see, right, we're going to export it. We're going to do this. And then we're going to dump this using PG dump in a consistent fashion out to a location profile, which is the terminology used, which could be an S3, could be NFS, could be just somewhere. But that is like we're instructing the database with a pg dump command basically to say we're going to take that. Now, standalone, if you're only running Postgres in your server, in your cluster, you could probably just get away with running a bash script. You don't need Kanister maybe. Where we see people adopting stateful workloads inside of Kubernetes, they go all in. Like we've got some Postgres, we've got some MySQL, we've got some Mongo. We might be also using RDS. How do I now back up all of them? I don't want a script for each one because who's going to maintain that? I just want to hit an easy button. And then that's where Kasten comes in to orchestrate Kanister to say, right, I want you to back up this way. I want you to back this up this way, and so on and so forth. Even reaching out of the cluster and hitting AWS RDS APIs to say, I'm going to protect you as well, because as well as the application concept inside of the cluster. And really, Kasten's an orchestrator.
I wasn't aware.
Yeah, there you go. So yeah, okay. We're basically hitting.
Yeah, you're talking to the Postgres API at the end of the day, using pgdump on both. It doesn't matter where the data is. You're talking through the application to get the data out through the application layer, not going to file system.
So this is an interesting one as well, Carlos. So a lot of people maybe they started in RDS, or maybe they started as a stateful set and they want to go either way, right? I want to go into RDS, or I want to get out of RDS and into a stateful set. So we can do it both ways there.
Migration.
As well. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, ultimately. I see
so
more
you're,
the other way.
You're saying I can tell people to migrate to RDS by using Kanister. Okay, I'm sold.
Yeah, so that's why I say like you'd prefer. I see more that way than I do the other way, as you'll be pleased to know.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, it depends. When a startup comes up, right? They use Helm charts, right? And they put crunchy data and they install Postgres and they have a lot of things in the cluster, and suddenly they hit like performance issues, or they don't know how to handle the operator of that Kubernetes cluster. They're not experts. They got something working, right? And they just want to move it. So this is very interesting. So I know that the book talks about Velero, but I think the consensus, I think from Scott, what I'm hearing is Velero is a very good tool for getting those YAML definitions, right? That you can do it with GitOps, but you can do it faster for certain situations where it's disaster. Like we have to come up like in minutes, and it's always good to have 3 backups of everything, right? Backup of my pictures at home, one in my mother's house, which is in Puerto Rico, and I have a Glacier S3, and I have like CDs from 10 years ago. I have pictures everywhere on my files, right? So backup that. And I think for the applications, which is stateful applications, which I think we talk about in Kubernetes, like we see here, long list, MongoDB, MySQL, Maria. Like, yeah, you can run them in Kubernetes. The problem that everybody has is the data, right? That data is super important. I need to back it up if something goes wrong. This Kanister with all these recipes or blueprints, can it stand on itself, or it depends on the other casting?
So yeah, you can 100. So Kanister is a CNCF project donated last year.
Oh, really?
But exactly to that point, Carlos, is that Kanister is only going to look after the data. It does not know anything about your YAML manifest or everything that builds up that whole application. That's where Velero, that's where Kasten, that's where blah, 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 any others come in. So Kanister is only for that. You raised a really good point, and I've done a session on this, is integrating backup into your GitOps pipeline for stateful workloads. Because we all know, like, GitOps, great, is a way of getting your application up and running, version 1, version 2. And that might consist of a database, a Postgres database in this instance, in your cluster. GitHub or Git is not going to have any idea about that database in there between version 1 and version 2. But we could create a config map that manipulates that data. And we all can make mistakes to make that happen. And that's why it's important to think about what that protection looks like. Or you'll see there's some really good talks about DevOps for databases as well, because it's just a similar mindset, but you have to think about how we you have to think of a database as a pet. They're not just going to be thrown away. Like if we delete that namespace of that application, yes, we can use Git to bring it back, but that database, that Postgres database that comes back is going to be empty. It's going to be empty. And that might be 3 years of work. It might be 3 weeks of mission critical payload. So,
or depending how that PVC was created, right? Michael, somebody uses a Helm, they do a Helm delete, and they like PVC deletes, and it's got a delete policy, right? Now, then they wonder, I recreated it. What happened? It's like, yeah, and doing a retain policy is just another fiasco, right? Because it's the claim by ref and trying to reclaim it. Yeah, you got to have that backup, and it sounds like for the 4th edition is not that Mark and I are thinking yet. There's a lot of work here. Would be adding this to it. Actually,
Yeah,
the 1st edition, we actually talk about PVC backups, Carlos. We covered Valero before, but never the PVC portion. And there were some reasons for that. The reason we, of course, use Velero was we keep it open source for our tools in the book. And we do mention, vendors, but although Kasten used to offer a 10-node copy, so you could even test the full thing, but still it wasn't quite open source. But yeah, combining the two, because I think, like you were saying, Michael, you need your resources as well. Let Kanister do that data, which is going to be again my one downfall of Velero, that concurrency with PVCs especially, is you put them together and you've got a pretty, I'm going to say solid solution. You're always going to get a better offering with full vendor, right? Because there's no UI with Velero. There was an open source project for it, but I think it kind of died. And I'm not a huge UI fan, but it's pretty good when you're doing backups, to be honest. It is nicer to see that kind of, short interface. Instead of having to look at all these CRs that you've created to go look at them.
Yeah. So yeah, this Kanister project looks very good. I don't know. Do you know, or Michael knows, when people use these Helm operators for Postgres? Like I think there's Crunchy Data, there's Cloud Native PG. What do they use for backup? Like, or they don't. They just say like you need to handle backups, or did they offer something like this? I will see something like pairing that with Kanister in terms of like defining how you do backups. But it looks like this Kanister has all the like recipes to instrument the backups.
So we have these Kanister blueprints. I like recipes though. That seems more fitting. So we have these blueprints for Crunchy Data. We have some around CMPG and EDB as well. But I will say that the operators have a lot more functionality built in to them already. So again, if you're
For backup
running,
specifically?
yes, yeah.
Oh, really?
So
Okay.
CMPG have the ability to do PG dump. And again, if you're only running CMPG, then that might be fine. What I see though, the beauty of cloud native and databases is that we can pick and choose what database we have for the job. If you go back 15 years, 10 years, even 5 years for some, we had an Oracle box or a Microsoft SQL box, and we had to ram all of our databases onto it, regardless of whether we wanted SQL or no SQL. No, make it work. And we're going to put all of the databases on one box or a cluster of SQL boxes, and that's what you had. Now, if you look at the landscape of databases, you've got SQL, NoSQL, maybe Mongo does something, maybe we bring in Cassandra, maybe we bring in key value, maybe the world of AI, vector databases as well, Weaviate and others. You've got Postgres, we've got everything, and we can pick and choose what's right for the application now, not be forced to do it was always dictated to us what database we should use. So we see a lot of people picking and choosing the database that they want. So you have multiple databases in the cluster.
Database as a service, right? Like becoming very popular.
Exactly.
And it really is, yeah.
Yeah, and I think I'm showing here one that I was looking in today because I started using the Blue Sky app. It's a social things like Twitter, and the people running it, they were mentioning that they're using the Scala, I don't know how to pronounce it, Scala database that is compatible with Cassandra. And I was looking into it, like how do I run in Kubernetes, and they have an operator to do that. I was looking to see if Kanister has a backup for it or not. So I think that's the learnings about like this chapter, or where is it? On the chapter teach you how to run MinIO. I want to mention something about MinIO. MinIO is something that you can run on, and then all the examples run in kind. So you can install MinIO to have an API that is an S3 compatible, your object storage, that then you can tell Velero to back up your manifest file, right? Your YAML files from the namespace and all those things, and backup etcd and backup PVCs. I think what we learned is for PVCs, not all PVCs are backup equally, I would say, right? PVCs that are unstructured data, it's okay to back them up. But if you're running stateful things, right? Don't say just Copia or Restic, or that's basically what these tools are doing. Restic and Copia are like two low-level utilities that copy files, and like they can start, if they get interrupted, they can start where they left to continue copying files over the target system, so you don't have to start from the beginning. And they're high performance things, but the problem is they're not application aware. They're not application that is Postgres, that is MongoDB, that is Redis. So you need to go through the application layer, and that becomes a problem. And also schedule. So I would say Velero for the etcd, Kanister for the recipes, and I wasn't looking at this example folder. Now that I open it during this meetup, I see that they have everything. They have KS Cassandra, they have Kafka, they have MySQL, and it's very useful to have them in one place. I call them blueprints or recipes, right? Because you see like what is the proper way to back up these things, and it looks like Michael said that this is a CNCF project. So I learned something new today. The thing that I would say, Scott, is with I think the raising of IDPs or internal developer platforms, at least what I'm seeing is a lot of platform teams are offering database as a service on this portal for developers, right? So day one, I think there are day one that they can say, oh, you go to the portal, you click a button, you give me a YAML file. The YAML file is a representation of the CR for an operator, for Redis, for MongoDB, even for a cloud provider database. Then comes day two, which I call the runbooks of like imperative actions. And I think this is the space where backups and schedule backups and restore, right? That button, that offering the button of saying like, how often do you want to back up the database that you created, right? If the database is in trouble, offer me a button that I can, restore from a drop down of like, what is where you want to restore. But so far, what I've seen is different companies have different level of maturities, but a lot of people are doing the day one. The day two, I think, is something that it comes in this space. I don't know what you have to say about that.
I'm a big fan of that shift left to give them that ability. Right now, I think the old heritage days where you called the backup team typically to do something, and I do want to, but you got to give them those. I'm going to say blueprints, probably the wrong word for this too, but to say here's what you need to back it up, but let them deal with that or give them a front end for it. But I am still kind of surprised at the number of places that aren't considering that. They might say, well, I've got my data being replicated. I'm like, well, that's great, except as one of my old instructors said once, if you're ugly here, you're still ugly here, right? So you need that backup to go backwards, though, because people often say, well, I'm already replicating. Yeah, but that means you're just going to replicate the corruption as well, right? So you got to have that.
Yeah. So I think this project is amazing. Like is kind of like I was trying to say, that imperative, right? You see like Michael said, this is a shell script. This is what I call imperative. This is a run book. If you're the SRE back in the days, we call them run books. I always thought like run books. In my head, it's like when there's a run book, I just run away because there's usually a fire happening. Associate that. But this is imperative task, and I've seen people do this with things like Jenkins, right? It's an imperative task. Also, I've been seeing people doing this with Argo workflows. Argo workflow is a very generic framework to run tasks, even Tecton. But I'm glad to see something that is specific, right, to backups, that is a CRD and a CR that is easy to plug into your IDP, that then you can drive from, because these recipes are going to live in Git, and they're going to get deployed with Flux or Argo at the end of the day, right? So they need to be driven from that standpoint of when you deploy something, you deploy the day to CRs, which are these ones when you deploy a database. I think we are up on time, but hopefully folks were able to, if you don't have the book, please get the book. The book has like details in terms of like sitting down. The GitHub repo is in the notes. The chapter is 14. So if you follow the instructions here, would tell you like quickly install kind, Minio, Velero, do a backup, do a restore, and it has that exercise. I didn't want to cover the exercise. I wanted to cover more of like best practices, and then right, that Velero may be useful for one thing. For the database applications, maybe Kanister is a good solution, and putting those two things together. And then like the myth of like that with everything defined in Git, you can just restore everything. That's not true. Even the state of the etcd.
And one of the exercises, Carlos, we actually create a second cluster, right, with kind, and you're restoring your data from the first one, just to show the steps, right? You may not use Valero necessarily in production, but backup's backup, right? The whole kind of process, what we use it for. And I do use it to go into a lab a lot, take something from a production area, even a non-prod, and I need it somewhere else to do tests. So it really comes in handy, and Valero works well for that.
Yeah, and it has a nice CLI, and it has schedules also. Have a CR for schedule that you can schedule that and go back and back up that.
Yep.
Okay. Let me see if I missed a question on the chat before we end. But I want to thank everyone that joined today. Hopefully this was a good session. We answered a few questions from the audience, and we'll see you. I think next week is US holiday in the US holiday. We're going to skip it, but then the week after, Seb is going to cover, because I'll be out in a conference for work, talking about Kubernetes, and I guess telling people about Kanister. I just discovered Kanister today, and then telling them about the book to join our book club. Okay, so with that we end, and thank you so much. We'll see you next time.
Great.
Thank
Thanks
you.
everybody as always for coming in.
Thank you.